Okay, this is probably the last video in the series looking at renewables breathing, because it's not a particularly complicated game. One thing I didn't explain properly in replacements is the fact that you can either build units out of the eliminated units boxes here for the costs I discussed in the last video, or you can rebuild existing units. Now, Germans and Axis units you can just rebuild directly into the units on the map. So if I had a unit here, let's a missing step, and I had a step of infantry replacements, I could build straight into that and bring it up to full strength. The Soviets, you can't do that. You can only build an existing unit up to full strength if it's in a Soviet town or city and in supply. Okay, we'll move on to a few of the logistics level and strategic level concepts in this game. Now, firstly, we've discussed line of communications and line of supply. We didn't really go into the fact that a unit that is out of supply or isolated has quite severe penalties against it. It has a -2 DRM in defense and attack. That in this game is really significant because it's the difference between getting favourable results and getting quite unfavourable results. It's quite a bloody combat results table in places. We've explained what supply sources are, etc. So we won't really go any further than that. But what I want to look at is things like railways, strategic movement. If I can find it, you're just going to have to excuse me. I have lost the page. So I'll use it off this abbreviated sequence of play, which is actually very good. It's on the back of the scenario booklet, and it discusses all the phases. So we've got a strategic movement phase here. So Axis rail movement starts on turn 11. You roll 2 dice and you can move that number of steps by rail along supply Axis control rail lines. In snow in 1944 onwards, the steps moved in Soviet Union count double against this limit. So that neatly gets rid of a lot of strategic donkey work. If you've ever played bigger games based on this, the German rail lines and Soviet rail lines are different gauges. So as they were going along, both sides had to convert or reconvert the railways as they were going through them and capturing them. Now, this requires a lot of overhead in these games where you're tracking all the rail lines that you've actually converted. This one abstracts this concept by using these supply depots, which are theoretical ends of converted rail lines, so without having to actually mark all the lines individually. Also, the fact that the German strategic rail doesn't come into turn 11 reflects the fact that the rail network just wasn't ready for any serious use by the Germans until they'd been in control of the area for a lot of time. It abstracts away partisans as well, because in more heavy versions of Eastern Front games, you will see that partisans units are actually on the board. Here it abstracts it in terms of the German rail movement is not available till later turns because there was a lot of Soviet units, sort of scattered units, making their way back to the Soviet front lines early in the war, and in the later war the partisans got more and more effective. So it shows that in the doubling of costs to move units later in the war by rail. Soviet rails is handled a lot more simplistically in the fact you get from turn 4 onwards, you can effectively move 4 steps per turn along in-supply Soviet rail lines. You can't move any unit that starts in an enemy zone. Well done. No, it starts or ends adjacent to an enemy unit in any point along that movement, along the rails. In terms of replacements, we've already looked at replacement factors and the fact that this is abstracted, very heavily abstracted. In most big games covering the Eastern Front, you will be expected to keep a track on your factories in the west of Russia being moved to the east of Russia, being set up beyond the Urals. This is all abstracted away based on these reinforcement factory cities. Other things you can do is Germans during the airbasing part of the strategic phase can move their air bases into any city or town in occupied territory. So they want to keep them as close to the front or close to the areas of the front where they're going to be operating heavily as possible. That movement can be any number of hexes, so long as you go to a city that is under German control and not adjacent to Soviet units. We've got other concepts like Soviet naval movement. Oddly enough, it doesn't do Axis naval. Oh, it does do Axis naval movement. Excuse me. The Axis Navy may transport 4 steps per turn in both Baltic and Black Sea, Sea of Azov, from friendly control ports to other friendly control ports not in the range of Soviet Strategic Air Force. Mechanized units count double for transport. Now, Soviets can also do naval movement. They've got 2 steps per turn in the Baltic, naval transport to and from during snow months in the Gulf of Finland, Black Sea, Sea of Azov, 4 steps per turn, Sea of Azov, only if the Soviets control both sides of the Kerch Strait, and you've got no transport to and from during snow turns. Other things you can do, the Soviets have an amphibious invasion capacity with the naval units, marine units here. So you can attempt amphibious invasions or invasion at or east of an Axis-controlled Sevastopol or Odessa. Okay, and there's a few other rules on that. Soviets have also got some airdrop capable units that, depending on certain conditions, they can drop these into threatened parts of the line. The Germans also have the ability to supply units that are cut off with air supply. So bear that in mind. Just because German units surrounded doesn't mean it's going to get wiped out. Though it didn't help the people at Stalingrad. Let's see, is there anything else we really want to talk about? There's things on the board which I haven't mentioned, which are like terrain features. There's fortified zones, which are these things here with the white things that basically give you a column shift in the defender's favour. They are destroyed once the unit's been wiped out or the hex is abandoned. There are some other units. There's fortresses like Breslau. There's forts like Königsberg. Okay, a fortress gives you defender doubled. Whereas a weak fort, that's odd that is, it's just the original terrain. It's a bit daft even having them on the board then, if that's the case. You've got defensive works, which are these red belts you see around Soviet cities like Moscow and Leningrad. These give a Soviet defender a +1 dice roll modifier when defending. Okay, let's think. Any other things we really want to mention? We haven't really discussed the concepts of advance and retreat after combat. So if a unit's forced to retreat, it'll get a DR result. That means it's got to retreat 2 hexes towards its line of retreat. And there's this retreat compass over here that shows you the sort of general direction you've got to go in. Now, you don't always have to go that way. If there's no other route, apart from somewhere else which is a legitimate retreat, just remember you can't retreat into enemy zones of control unless it's negated by a friendly unit. There are other options, but you've still got to retreat 2 hexes. If you do retreat into a hex which is friendly occupied but an enemy zone of control, you lose an extra step. Units that are forced to retreat and get a DR asterisk result will lose a step if they have multiple steps. Advances after combat are bog standard. Basically, the hex that you've attacked is either is left unoccupied for any reason, whether it's an exchange or defender loses a step, defender eliminated, or a defender retreat. You can advance into that hex up to the stacking limits. Obviously, that only includes units that were in the original attack. Can't think of much else I'd want to say about it. Victory points. Victory points are basically, and victory conditions are based on the control of these VP hexes on the boards. You just keep a running total and you've got to achieve a certain amount by a certain time. And you're tracking those on your victory point tracker over there. Weather is something else we've sort of touched on. The weather affects how far you can move axis depots, because axis depots move forward along the rail lines in the depot advancement phase, and the worse the weather, the shorter the advance they can make. Weather, there's loads of different types of weather. You've got fair, mixed, mud, snow. That's snow first winter, snow subsequent winters. Oh, that's 42 plus and snow. These all have various effects on units, and they're controlled by these colours on the board. So that one's mixed mud, that one's mud, that one's mixed snow, and that one's snow. These light ones here are clear. So as I've discussed, that can affect things like air supply, axis attrition from air supply. It affects movement points of axis mechanised and motor units. It can even affect every unit if it's mud. You can't do forced marches, which is something I haven't discussed. that normally you can move whatever your movement allowance is, but any infantry non-mechanised type unit can do a force march to add two movement factors to their total. Just remember, if you're doing a force march, you can only do it in your once per turn. So not once per round, a round being whenever a formation chip's drawn. It's once per turn, that's once per month. Let's think. Yeah, certain things in snow. Soviet shock armies in the first winter are doubled in strength when attacking at full or half strength and in supply. So I think that pretty much covers everything for this particular game. I know I haven't gone into fantastic detail, but it should give you an idea on how complex it is, which I don't think it is particularly complex. This rule book is 27 pages. So there are quite a few little variations on the things I've told you. I've given you a good view of what each mechanism is, but I haven't gone into massive detail about some of the fine detail of those particular mechanics.